Hello, I'm Larry Wilson, and welcome to this segment in our study on the book of Revelation. I thought I would take this opportunity to deal with the topic of God's wrath in light of the current disaster that has happened in southern Asia. I think it's very important that Christians understand the difference, the distinct difference between the wrath of God and a random act or a random event that causes enormous destruction. When God sends wrath, He sends warning, because God's wrath has purpose. It is part of a plan. It comes in its first phase as a redemptive measure, and then He tries to redeem the situation, but if people continue in their defiance, then total destruction follows. There's a big difference between the destruction that comes from God's wrath and a random event that causes great destruction. And the difference is reason and understanding. There's a purpose for what God does. There's no purpose behind a random event. Yes, God can bring a good purpose out of a random event, but the random event is not caused by purpose. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called a random event. I'll explain more about that in just a minute. But I want to go back to the point that when Israel was becoming corrupt as a nation and God's patience was getting threadbare, God did something that was very interesting. He sent Jonah, a prophet in Israel, over to Nineveh, a city that was terribly wicked. And by sending a Jew to the Gentiles, if you will, Jonah got there and told the king and the city that in 40 days God was going to destroy the city unless the city repented of its great wickedness. And lo and behold, the Ninevites repented, and the destruction that was promised was stalled. It didn't happen. And you may recall how Jonah was furious about it because he looked like a false prophet. But he had predicted, had he not, that if the Ninevites would repent of their great sins, God would not destroy them. Well, God did this shortly before the destruction of Israel and then later Judah. He wanted His own people to see that the Gentiles were more receptive to a prophet than His own people were. The city of Nineveh was spared, only to be destroyed about 160 years later. The Ninevites returned to their wicked ways, and God eventually destroyed it. The same is also true of Israel. You may recall that after Nebuchadnezzar twice captured Jerusalem and took away the people, the citizens, as captives, he then had to come back a third time and literally destroy the temple. And then you know how in Daniel 9 the prophecy was given that God was going to give Israel another chance. They were going to rebuild the temple. They were going to rebuild the city wall. And this, of course, was accomplished. But then Israel rejected the Lord, rejected Jesus as Messiah. And so Jerusalem was destroyed again, and the temple was destroyed again in AD 70 by divine decree. You may recall in Daniel 9, this destruction was prophesied. Let's go to the book of Daniel and take a look. The prophecy reads, after the 62 sevens, or the 62 weeks, remember the 7 and 62, after the 69 weeks of 483 years, the anointed one, speaking of Jesus, will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. This happened. This was fulfilled. At the end of the 62 weeks, Jesus, the Anointed One, the Messiah, was cut off. That means he was disinherited and hung on a cross outside the city. And he was separated, rejected, cut off from his own people. So the prophecy goes, the people of the ruler who will come, the people of the ruler of Rome who will come, will destroy the city, that is Jerusalem, and the temple. And this took place, just as prophesied. And the end will come like a tsunami. The destruction will be that devastating. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations upon Jerusalem have been decreed. Notice what this says. War will continue until the end. The city of Jerusalem will never be without war, and desolations have been predetermined. The key point here is that God's wrath and his judgments are not random nor arbitrary. God does not throw temper tantrums. God is not cruel and mean. God is patient and generous. But as sovereign king, he is firm and consistent. He not only concerns himself with the present generation, but the generations to come. He knows what is good and what is evil, and he will not endlessly tolerate evil. As a good parent, God is deliberate and purposeful when it comes to punishing his children. So what caused the earthquake and disaster on December 26, 2004? Well, consider this. Earthquakes have been taking place ever since the creation of earth. When God separated the dry land from the water on the third day of creation, I believe he did this with a global earthquake. Genesis 1, verse 9. He moved the earth around. He separated the dry land from the water with a global earthquake. The second movement of the ground is recorded in the Bible in Genesis 10:26. This global earthquake occurred when God broke up the single land mass of earth, and he pulled large chunks of land apart. We call these chunks or pieces of land continents, and God moved them into their respective places in a very short period of time. He did this soon after the people were scattered from the Tower of Babel. You can read it. It's just mentioned in one verse, Genesis 10:26. Then there was an earthquake in Elijah's day, 1 Kings 19:11. There was a great earthquake when Uzziah was king in Jerusalem, Amos 1:1. There was a great earthquake when Jesus died, Matthew 27:54. You remember in Acts 16, verse 26, Paul and Silas started singing in jail, and there was a great earthquake that shook off their bonds, their handcuffs. They were taken out of the stocks. So great was that earthquake. So great was their singing, I say. How about this? An earthquake killed 800,000 people in China on January 23, 1556. An earthquake killed 143,000 people in Japan on September 1, 1923. Another earthquake in China is believed to have killed 655,000 people on July 27, 1976. My point here is that earthquakes have been going on for thousands of years. In fact, every year there are thousands of earthquakes, small ones. And did you know that during the 20th century, According to the U.S. Geological Survey, our planet experienced 2,051 earthquakes having a magnitude of 7 or greater. Earthquakes have been going on for thousands of years, thousands of them. We had 2,000 of them in the 20th century alone that were greater than 7 on the Richter scale. Consider this. In 1958, a tsunami caused by a landslide in a small Alaskan waterway reached a height of 1,732 feet. That is almost a third of a mile high. That is a very tall tsunami. By contrast, the tsunami that hit southern Asia was only about 30 feet tall. In 1936, another tsunami hit Alaska that was 495 feet tall. This information, incidentally, can be found at the the NOAA Weather Survey group on the internet. 1936, another tsunami hit Alaska that was 495 feet tall. In 1868, a tsunami hit Hawaii that was 66 feet tall. Since 1812, 10 tsunamis have hit the coast of California, having a height exceeding 10 feet. The highest tsunami occurred in 1934, and the wave was about 40 feet tall. I don't think I'd want to live in California or Florida or around the Gulf or the perimeter of the Gulf. I just don't like the idea of living next to a lot of liquid. It's nice to go look at it. I just don't want to live next to it. Do you really think that each earthquake and each tsunami is an act of God? Do you really think so? If so, what point is God trying to make? What's the message? What's the purpose? Most of all, earthquakes are a function of random forces. And discerning between an act of God and a random event is most important. Most, but not all earthquakes are a function of random forces. And discerning between them is important. Randomness. Let me introduce you to a new word. Randomness is an interesting component of God's creation. The word randomness means uncontrolled, subject to chance. God has put a small amount of randomness in every aspect of life. For example, look at the DNA selection that makes up each human being. 2 children from the same 2 parents can have very different characteristics. It's random. Randomness produces good things and bad things. We see random events in the universe. Asteroids randomly collide with moons. And you might recall in 1994, a string of 21 plowed into Jupiter. Stars are randomly captured by the incredible pull of black holes. Snowflakes are not identical, and fingerprints are not identical because of randomness. People don't look alike because of an entity in creation called randomness. In fact, randomness makes every human being unique in a physical way and a spiritual way as well. Randomness can produce disastrous results. Cars randomly collide and people get killed. Accidents happen because of randomness. Not long ago, I was talking with my dad after he had been in a car wreck. Dad was impressed, as he thought about it, by the precise timing of the accident. He told me one day about the exact timing that he and the other man had left their respective houses, and that they had driven different distances and traveled different roads. And he mentioned how they had stopped at different stoplights in town, only to collide at the intersection where they met. After thinking about his comments for a moment, I said, if you had driven through that intersection without incident, would your passing through the intersection have been a random event? And Dad said, well, yes. And I said, so you and the other man and a dozen other cars who were present at the accident randomly passed through this intersection at a moment in time. But two of you attempted to do so while going in different directions. So I said, you experienced a random collision. Some people just call it bad luck. Some people think it was predestined, but it's not. Randomness caused the accident. Because people have the power of choice, it is inevitable that collisions will occur. Geologists tell us that all of Earth's tectonic plates are constantly moving. On December 26, huge geological forces caused the India and Burma plates to break loose under the Indian Ocean. This caused a random earthquake, and a tsunami followed, which brought about much destruction. Does God permit earthquakes to happen? Sure. Does God permit destructive tsunamis to occur? Sure. Both of these events are consistent with the laws of physics. The point here is that God put some randomness within the movement of Earth's tectonic plates in the beginning. And this is why earthquakes have been happening ever since. Thousands and tens of thousands of them. 2,000 exceeding 7 on the Richter scale during the 20th century alone. God did not create the tsunami, nor did God suddenly destroy 150,000 people in southern Asia. Unlike Noah's flood, randomness caused this terrible tragedy. This is a key point. Unlike Noah's flood. What's the difference between the destruction here and the destruction in Noah's day? Very important and significant difference. In Noah's day, it was the wrath of God. In southern Asia, randomness caused this terrible tragedy. That's the important point you have to understand. Well, let's look at this question. If God knows everything and has all power, why didn't God prevent the tsunami and save 150,000 lives? This question is similar to a question that I often hear. If God knew that Lucifer was going to sin, and God foreknew the consequences of sin, why did he create Lucifer? This question is at the heart of next month's study. We will begin our study with the 7 seals next month. So please anticipate this interesting question being examined. For now, the short answer is that God did not prevent Lucifer from sinning, and God does not prevent disasters from occurring. Sin is a huge disaster. It cost the life of Jesus. And how many people have died as a result of sin? How many billions can you count since Adam and Eve were upon the earth? You see, God does not view disasters as we do. God does not see death as we do. God has infinite wisdom and power. He is sovereign, and He permits tragic things to happen because He is consistent, lawful, and righteous. He does not manipulate things for His benefit, but He is able to bring out of every tragedy something good. God rarely violates the law of cause and effect. He always, though, deals with human tragedy, whether random or deliberate, in a way that ultimately proves to be wise and beneficial. Yes, our suffering may eclipse our knowledge of God's loving interest in us. When people are hurting and suffering, they tend to shake their fist at God and curse Him. But God understands how that our suffering may blind us. But our suffering is for a moment. The joy that He has in mind will be eternal. You see, God always brings good out of bad. When you look at the cross of Jesus, what do you see there? Do you see the price paid for your salvation? Or do you see a man terribly beaten, unjustly and inhumanely treated, dying because of hatred? How do you see the cross? Is it an object of great adoration because there is where the price was paid and God's love demonstrated? Or do you see the tragedy of the cross? How do you balance that out in your own thinking? That'll explain to a great extent how you balance out random tragedy and God's wrath. There's good news within the horrible tragedy in southern Asia. You see, death is not a big deal to God. One day, God will just speak the word, and He will resurrect the dead, and He will give eternal life to those who were faithful and true to all they knew to be right. The Bible teaches that God overrules every tragedy, not by preventing it, but by bringing good out of it. Already we see good rising from this tragedy. Fractious nations are working together for the first time for the sake of compassion. Kindness is being extended to the helpless and to the homeless. And this is a sample of God making lemonade out of a random lemon that hit southern Asia. The earthquake and tsunami in southern Asia qualifies as a horrible, a terrible, but random event. Now, I want you to, in the last few minutes that we have here, I want you to consider what the book of Revelation predicts. The book of Revelation predicts tsunamis and earthquakes on a scale that will dwarf what happened in southern Asia. I want to take you to my little drawing here, and I want you to look down here at the bottom of the screen, and I want you to notice that the book of Revelation predicts 3 global earthquakes. There's one here at the beginning of the Great Tribulation. There's one here at the end of the 7th trumpet. This green box up here, the 7 trumpets. At the end of the 7th trumpet, there's a global earthquake. And then there's a global earthquake at the second coming, at this line right here. There are 3 global earthquakes predicted in the book of Revelation. While you're thinking about that, I want you to take a look at the computer screen. Now, these earthquakes in the book of Revelation will not be random earthquakes. God has already warned us about them by putting them in His Word, and there is a global reason and a global purpose for each of these earthquakes. The third one occurs at the second coming of Jesus. And you can find that in Revelation 16:18. The second one occurs at the end of the 7th trumpet, as I just mentioned a moment ago, Revelation 11:19. And the first one occurs at the beginning, or the commencement of the Great Tribulation. So how do we know these 3 earthquakes in the book of Revelation are global, since Revelation does not use the word global to describe these earthquakes? Well, let me show you how this works. The third earthquake occurs at the second coming, or which is also identified as the seventh bowl in Revelation 16. Let's look at these two verses. Then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since man has been on earth, so tremendous was the quake. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. Now, if every island and every mountain fled away, would that suggest a global event? Do you think the second coming is a global event? Sure. The same event is described in Revelation 6:12 through 17, which is the sixth seal. I watched as the Lamb opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, and the whole moon turned blood red. And the stars in the sky fell to earth, as late figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The sky receded up like a scroll, rolling up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. So, it's easy. The third earthquake has to be global because every mountain and island is removed from its place. And if the third earthquake is global, then what about the other two that occur before it? Here are two reasons why all three earthquakes will be global. First, consistency. In all three earthquakes, the same five phenomena occur: lightning, thunder, voices, earthquake, and hail, burning hail. In all three earthquakes, we have a consistency. So what happens at one is similar with the others. The second thing that is evidence supporting the idea that these three earthquakes are global is the scope of Revelation's story. In Revelation 3:10, Jesus talks about the test that's going to come upon the whole world. And in Revelation 13:10, Jesus talks about the fact that all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. The scope of Revelation's story is global. Why wouldn't the earthquake be global? If the earthquake in southern Asia didn't cause you to miss a meal, how much tribulation did it really put up on your table? No, the Great Tribulation is for everybody. It's for all of us, and we're all going to experience it. In our next segment, I'm going to deal with a text that has puzzled a lot of people. And that text is Psalm 91, where the Lord has promised in His Word, people think, that no plague shall come nigh thy dwelling. Well, that's all we have time for in this segment. May God bless you, and we'll see you in the next.